Good morning. Many of you have had questions and concerns related to the recent communication regarding the use of human imagery or the American Indian head silhouette as a logo for the Okemos Chiefs. The Chieftain head logo is not being banned. We will not police or stop students from wearing this clothing. The decision and commitment made 7 years ago was that the school district would no longer promote, purchase, or distribute new apparel or equipment that has human imagery or stereotypical symbols or items on them. For some, this recommitment will not be noticed, as Okemos High School has not competed in athletic uniforms with the American Indian head logo on them in years, nor has the gymnasium floor or mats along the walls sported human imagery. Likewise, the new OHS donor brick wall located at the student entrance has the approved O combined with the scripted word Chiefs. The district revisited this issue because of the reappearance of the American Indian head silhouette in our school store and on some of the athletic apparel. We recognize that for some, this was a reminder of our commitment established 7 years ago, and for others, this is new. We also recognize that many are trying to understand the why behind this decision. How is it offensive? How does this not demonstrate honor and pride? And why is this allowed in other schools and athletic teams, to name a few? All of these are relevant questions, and we are committed to providing the answers to these questions and explaining the rationale behind the 2004 decision in an effort to create a better understanding. On Tuesday of this week, we assembled some experts to respond to questions that have come from students. The experts include Dr. Phil Belfi, who is the founding member of the Michigan State University American Indian Study Program, Professor Matthew Fletcher and Elaine Barr from the Indigenous Law and Policy Center at Michigan State University, and Mr. Chris Smith, the chair of our Social Studies Department here at Okemos High School. I now invite you to view the roundtable discussion as it relates to the use of human imagery and stereotypical symbols and items as our school logo.
Hannah, why don't you ask our first question?
Okay. Well, my first question is pretty basic. I think some of the students, I don't want to say uproar, but some of the misunderstanding might be coming from what exactly are the changes that are being made to our logo or our mascot. And I think students have been hearing a lot of things like we're now the Okemos O's, or we can't say or print the word Chiefs at all, in addition to the logo. So I was just wondering what exactly is being changed.
Okay. Just kind of in response to that question, really, again, the communication that I shared with students last week was communication to reaffirm the board's commitment and to not purchase, sell, or distribute any merchandise or apparel associated with the school that would have the American Indian logo or any stereotypical images or items. And so that decision really came out of a large committee and a great study in response to the 2002-2003 resolutions, both from the Civil Rights Commission as well as the State Board of Michigan, saying again that schools, educational facilities should not, again, promote, use Native American or Native American Indian mascots or nicknames as their school logo. So 7 years ago, the school board as well as the district made a commitment to no longer use that stereotypical image and went to the O that you've seen throughout the building with the scripted Chiefs. And right now, again, yes, we are currently still the Okemos Chiefs.
Okay, that's good to clarify. Okay, so the word Chiefs can still be used to say we're the Okemos Chiefs, and that can still also be printed on T-shirts and such.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
I'll keep going. So another sentiment that I've heard among the student body is coming from this place of the reason that we call ourselves the Okemos Chiefs is because our town is named after Chief Okemos, and I think that's something that we as we grow up in this community, it's something that we're reminded of and we're very proud of. So students feel that because it sort of, their sentiment is not to be offensive, but rather out of respect from the community, they feel that they're doing their best to make it a positive symbol, and I think students want to know why that still causes discussion.
Mr. Fletcher.
Yeah, that is a powerful sentiment. This notion that this is a question of honor and respect for Chief Okemos and for Indians from this community. But I see two problems with that. And I don't think Okemos is different than any other place in the country that is named an area or a community or a town or a school after a group of Indians or after an individual Indian, as in this case. And it flows from 19th century and even into the 20th century notions of what we call now the vanishing Indian, the myth of the vanishing Indian. If you know anything about Indian law and policy, the whole point of 19th century and probably the first 2/3 of 20th century American Indian law and policy was eventually the Indians are going to go away. They're going to disappear, or they're going to assimilate and become just like everyone else. They're not going to still be around demanding access to land and to the resources that they once had. The true honoring of American Indians, and mind you, I'm a law professor, and I come to much of this discussion from that point of view of what the big picture of American Indian law and policy is about. And the true honoring of American Indians is to revisit the treaties that John Okemos is alleged to have helped to negotiate, and he participated in these discussions, to revisit those and to actually honor them. And to make those things real and to enforce them and to implement them the way that the United States and the Indian communities here in Michigan have negotiated in good faith way back in the 19th centuries. And believe me, none of those treaties were ever truly enforced. That would be a true honoring. And revisiting treaties is a dramatically different thing than naming a community after an American Indian after he has passed away.
Hannah, your last question. Oh, go ahead.
I think a lot of people, they don't consider it to be a marker of what is gone, but rather a way of remembering him for what he's provided to the community.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, I think a lot of people still consider it to be an honor. Like, we're respecting him for what he's done, not now that he's gone.
Okay. Well, I recognize that. And I've looked at some of the websites that sort of that are put out by the school or the students or parents here in the Okemos community, and it's not entirely clear to me what particular thing he is being honored for. If he is being honored for, and again I use that phrase liberally, if he is being honored for the fact that he agreed to leave or to sign a treaty in which he and his community ceded this territory and agreed to go somewhere else. I believe in the reservation is in Portland, just down the road, the highway now, and leave you guys alone. It is not honoring him to say, thank you for leaving, we'll name the town after you. Mm-hmm. That said, the other things that he could be honored for, and what I've seen in some of the materials, particularly from the sports community, is that, and I quote from the website, he went on the warpath. When you honor an American Indian for being violent and savage, you're not honoring them either. Indian people, I don't think any people, any community in the world fights for honor and fame. That would be a very sad community to be a part of. American Indian people fought out of a sense of desperation, usually out of incredible pressure from the outside. The War of 1812, for example, was a terrible atrocity visited upon everybody who was a participant in that. And I understand that John Okemos was a part of that, according to your website. I also heard, I don't know if this is true, there never was a John Okemos. We don't really know for sure. Mm-hmm. But that aside, assuming that he does exist, it is not honoring him, I don't think, or the Indian people of Michigan or anywhere, to say thank you for leaving, or we honor you because you were a great fighter. Mm-hmm. And neither one of those is something that American Indian people, I can say, I hate making broad generalizations, but I can say that for the vast majority of American Indian people don't want to be honored for either of those things. They would rather be honored for who they were, and for who they are to this day, and more especially to what they are to this day.
I think that brings up a couple of interesting points in my mind. Kind of first off, you mentioned that people really associate the name with the community and so forth, but I don't think that we as a community that we explicitly value American Indian values here specifically. And so I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Like when I was first hired here 9 years ago, a school board member told me, she said, people don't move here for the mall, they don't move here for the downtown, they move here for the schools. That's why people are here, is because these schools have a good reputation. And it was kind of like a little bit of a speech like, I want you to understand how important the schools are to this community. But no part of the speech that school board member gave me was, and we really want you to honor American Indian values as part of our culture. That was never communicated to me as a new staff member. That was part of what we do in the Okemos Public Schools. So now there's like, oh, but this is our values, this is our identity. That's not the way it was really communicated to someone coming into the community, a little while ago. And it kind of brings up just some other, like some silly things. Like we have a kiva here in the school. Kiva is an American Indian term, but it's not a kiva. It's a Western auditorium. It looks nothing like a kiva looks. So I think sometimes we just have to like look beyond things a little bit and say like, okay, like we sort of assumed this identity, but we didn't really put any of that into practice. And so I think there's a little bit of a disconnect with saying this is our identity. I've always been told that our identity is a high-performing school district, and it's been kind of a very single-minded goal. And no one up until last week had told me that our identity was this very strong American Indian connection.
Bryson.
My question is, why is the chieftain head?
I think that offensive is probably an understatement of the issue. Harmful is probably a more appropriate word to characterize what's going on. As Matthew said, as Mr. Fletcher said, it's difficult to be an Indian person, period. But to have to choose a different place to live because of the community that has adopted this symbol, this name, this logo, is another issue on top of it. And it was discussed earlier. This is meant to honor. This is meant to honor a population, or in this case, a specific Indian. But there's a difference between intent and effect. The effect on Indian students of just mascots in general, you see decreased academic performance, higher rates of depression, anxiety, hostility even, in communities where there are these nicknames and logos. And it's bad for the communities that adopt these too, because they're more likely to rely on stereotypes when they think of people of other races too, not just American Indians.
One of the problems that a lot of the students have with this change is they feel there's kind of a very, very small minority that wants this. Obviously, you guys disagree with that, and I understand that. But a lot of people just kind of, they want to know what data there is, and if they could see that data that supports the change, I think that would make people feel a lot more comfortable with it. So is that going to be made available?
Well, I'm happy to, I'll interject. You sort of...
Go for it.
Elaine is a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. She grew up in a rural community outside of Jackson, and she's been doing an enormous amount of research for us at the Indigenous Law and Policy Center, which is in this folder. We've also made, these kinds of studies are relatively new within the last 10 years, but there are a lot of psychological studies that Elaine alluded to. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a psychologist, I'm a law professor, and we're mostly known as lawyers for not knowing how to do math and that sort of thing. So, but there is an enormous amount of increasing amount of study about the impacts of American Indian names, logos, and mascots, both on American Indians. You can imagine I already described our experiences, and they're very subjective, but also on non-Indians, and particularly how harmful they are to communities or school districts that have few or no American Indian students. So there's really nobody to respond. or to put forth a point of view. So the data is available. We have a blog, a law blog called Turtle Talk. So if you Google Turtle Talk and click on what we call the ILPC research areas, we have a page there that has, and we'll be adding to it as these things come out, but there's a page there with a series of PDFs that are published articles, a couple of dissertations, all within the last 7 or 8 years, studying people at the University of North Dakota, studying people at other school districts, and what happens to them when they're essentially inundated with these sort of things. My wife and I, incidentally, started teaching for 2 years from 04 to 06 at the University of North Dakota, which has their logo and name is the Fighting Sioux. And they've gone, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But there is plenty of data, but it's all new, right? So I think that there is much more work to be done in discussing this. But the real issue is not so much that it's offensive, because certainly it is offensive to, and in this context, a minority of people. I think that's fair to say. It may be. I don't really know. And what constitutes a question of being offensive is a very subjective thing. It means something completely different to different people. But these studies, which are hard psychological and sociological data, indicate that that depression and anxiety contributes directly to the decrease in academic performance and just overall happiness. So it is available, and we're happy to, and it's already online. And I have some hard copies I'm going to give your principal here right afterwards. And
I think that
I'd like to add one other thing. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same study, but there was a University of North Dakota study, and it showed all of those things that you say. But I think it's important to remember that that study showed that it had a detrimental effect on everybody, all students, whether they were Native or not, or whether they supported the logo or not.
Yeah.
Everybody was affected, and negatively, by just the simple presence of that hostility.
That study was I think the one you're talking about was done by a UND student named Angela LaRocque. And so that she has a couple of papers. Her dissertation is available, and it includes pictures of what she showed, the methodology, the pictures that she showed students at UND, to give them a sense of, some of them were pretty innocuous. Here's just logo. Some of them were, and there was a second set of pictures that were mostly generated by non-official sources, other schools or students on campus that don't have anything to do with the university, that were grotesquely offensive. And I don't think anybody in this room would find them anything but objectively offensive. So that there were two sets to the study, but even the one that was innocuous, that it generated an enormous psychological impact on people.
Yeah, if I can hop in here real quick. If it's not just the individual school, by nature you have opponents when you play against other teams in sports. They, I don't want to say naturally say derogatory things, but the reaction is to say derogatory things.
I think another thing that goes in there, it goes back to your question. You mentioned, well, this seems like a very small minority that's bringing this up. However, I would challenge us to think about, well, what if it was a different minority? So what if it was a different religious minority or racial, ethnic minority? And they said to us as a community, they said, your mascot is harmful, and we find it offensive. I doubt that with some of the other vocal minorities in the country that we'd say, well, you're such a small representation of our community that we're just not going to take that into account. I think any group that tells us if we're doing something that's offensive, I think that's really a time to pause and to reflect on what they've said, and to listen when someone tells you that they feel offended.
But what people feel is that it's not just like a minority of American Indians, but even within that American Indian community, there's a minority who finds this offensive. Well, most, I guess, don't feel either way.
I don't know. I mean, as I researched this issue and I started looking at the expansive list of American Indian organizations that said it was offensive, it didn't seem like a minority to me. It seemed like a pretty good majority that was saying very clearly that this was a bad practice. And furthermore, other things that contributed to my own thinking as I started looking through groups of non-American Indian groups that were saying this is offensive and that it should be stopped. And so, and these are major organizations in the United States that were saying, please don't do this. And that, like I said, really began to shape my thinking on the issue, that it's time to listen about these issues.
There are at least 117 organizations that have come out against the use of racial imagery in mascots, and no comparable organization has come out in support because it is harmful. I think we need to back away from the language of being offensive because it's this very squishy sort of thing, but harm is not a squishy thing. It is real, it is concrete.
And I think in asking, you asked for the data, I think that's one of the things that over time we've gathered and we've researched, and again, relying on some of the different organizations. And so those things have been made available and will continue to be made available for students and for parents and for all of us. So thank you. Maria, you had a question.
Are there any modifications that could be made to our current logo to make it more acceptable to the Native American community?
I'll tackle that. First of all, my understanding of your logo is that is a head with a headdress, sort of the classical American Indian head, like a buffalo nickel type of thing. And first of all, at least in Michigan here, that kind of headdress is exceedingly rare to non-existent. That headdress usually consists of a large number of eagle feathers, and it is mostly local to the Great Plains region. American Indians here certainly wore feathers at times in particular circumstances, but not like that. That is not local at all. So importantly, I suppose you could try to adjust to take that away, to just have a picture of an Indian head, or maybe something that's more, true to the local American Indians. But the deal is this: American Indians dress like we do, like Phil and I and Elaine and I. We don't dress like that on a day-to-day basis, or typically in a professional circumstance. So that's not who we are every single day, and it's a caricature. And I'll give you an example of even where a school has adjusted its logo over the course of time to become less and less offensive, it still remains offensive to people. And I bring up the Fighting Sioux is probably the best example. They've been the Fighting Sioux for 60 or 70 years, and their logo started out as just ridiculously offensive. And over the course of time, as you entered the 60s and 70s, it became a little more abstract, a little bit less offensive. But ultimately, in the 90s, particularly in the late 90s, which is long ago, they actually hired a guy. And they're the Fighting Sioux. They hired a guy who was Chippewa to do a picture of an Indian head that was much more true to, it was actually kind of cool looking. I mean, it was sort of modernist, almost abstract art. It was a great picture, but and they plastered it all over the school and all over the arena there, but it was still a caricature of what basically non-Indians think Indians look like, or what the non-Indians at UND wanted Indians to look like, what they needed them to look like. So there's really no American Indian logo that you could use, no matter how cool it looks or no matter how respectful it is. It's still a picture of a person. And occasionally people will say, well, if you can't have any pictures of any Indians, then why do we have pictures of, Spartans or fighting Irish or something like that? And I would say they shouldn't do that either. I haven't seen the same kind of, I don't think 117 organizations have come out against that. I bet you some have, but I bet you some would come out in favor of it. I don't know. That's an issue that's separate. But I just don't see the kind of American Indian logo that is respectful in the way that American Indians want to be respected or honored.
I can just reiterate, too, on that question, Maria. I know when the committee looked at research, some of the language that went into that research was to prohibit human imagery as a mascot, as a logo. And so again, in our communications, that's really what we are echoing or reaffirming, that commitment not to use human imagery. So, Bryson, you have a question?
Yeah, this kind of goes along with Marie's last question, but are arrows and feathers and images that aren't necessarily on the Indian, are those also considered offensive?
Well, I have my parts of my bundle out here right now. And this is an eagle feather. And in our culture, this is not something to be used as a mascot or a symbol or whatever of our culture. And what we would use this for is a representation of our commitment to speak the truth, to honor our culture, and to use it in a way that dishonors us is just, it's very, very harmful.
And to just kind of follow up on that, there is spirituality in everything that you have here, and it is dehumanizing to use it for anything else. I have a book here, it's called Team Spirits, and on the cover it's an American Indian person holding a sign saying, "I am not a mascot." Anything that incorporates those into anything other than what they are is dehumanizing.
Talk to us about a little bit about sometimes, again, at sporting events, you might see the tomahawk chop. And I can probably predict, I know the answer, but I want to hear your response to that practice, sort of say.
I would, again, say that it's dehumanizing, and I think that it not only does it reinforce stereotypes, but it leads to this thinking that Indian people are a people of the past and that they don't currently exist, which is patently untrue.
I would add, a tomahawk is, I mentioned this yesterday, a tomahawk wasn't designed to hit people. It was designed to, the classic case here in Michigan would be to carve out a birch bark canoe or for some useful purpose that did not involve destruction, that involved life. And so, the tomahawk had become a symbol of American Indian savagery hundreds of years ago because of non-Indians saying this is what Indians do. They come at us with their tomahawks and try to chop us up and hit us. And so, it became a symbol of Indian law. It even was incorporated into, the United States Supreme Court decisions. They would say, well, Indians would they don't have the right or the capacity to sue or participate in our political processes. All they know is the tomahawk. That is their answer to everything, which was just patently untrue. And so to keep using that kind of imagery in the 21st century is, just anathema. It's just totally offensive and not justified in any way.
Okay, thank you.
My hope is that after viewing this, students can maybe gain a better understanding, a better empathy for these other opinions. So yeah, I'm just wondering, for instance, I know that I think the marching band uniforms have a chieftain head on the side, and when we're going through financial difficulties and replacing these things is very difficult. So I'm wondering where we would go from here and what's the next step.
I think the thing that we're looking at right now is just building a better understanding. I mean, that's truly where we are, even though, again, some of us have been here before 7 years ago when really our commitment and our calling was to begin to build a better understanding. We're back here, but we're going to do it a much better job this time. I think that's one place we start. I think another thing, too, is again, our commitment is not to, again, sell, distribute, purchase from here on out. So I know, again, obviously it's a transition. There are baby steps. It is a process. So again, we're not going to go out and purchase all brand new band uniforms, let's say, for example. That's an $80,000 investment. But we are not going to purchase, when the time comes, we're not going to purchase additional band uniforms with that same logo. We will be transitioning in phasing to our more contemporary logo. And so I think that's the thing that we need to again, building that capacity and that understanding. And yes, it starts with each and every single one of us as we grow as learners and as we become more aware of the harm that this practice is doing not only to ourselves but to all. And I think that's one of the things that we need to pride ourselves on in Okemos is that celebration of diversity and that acceptance of all. And so I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank our guests for coming to the high school today. I want to thank the students for putting together the questions and asking our panel, and really do appreciate the time and commitment and dedication that everybody is having. And again, thank you for viewing.
Thank you for your attention. It is our hope that this roundtable discussion answered some of your questions and assisted in explaining some of the rationale behind the 2004 board decision in an effort to create a better understanding. Your classroom teacher will now provide you with an opportunity to reflect upon and discuss the content presented in the roundtable discussion. Thank you.